I'm Clarke Lemay. I use pronouns she, her. I'm the acting senior historian at the National Portrait Gallery and the interim director of Portal, the Portrait Gallery's Scholarly Center. And we're delighted that you're joining us right now. Thank you. Today's program is a conversation about Edmonia Lewis and Wendell Phillips. I'm so excited to moderate a conversation between Hélène Quanquin, professor of American Studies at the Université de Lille in France, and Kirsten Pai Buick, professor of art history, associate dean of equity and excellence for the College of Fine Arts, and inaugural chair of Africana studies, all at the University of New Mexico. Before we begin, we'd like to give a land acknowledgement. Although we are tuning in together today from many different places, as you can see in the chat, we gratefully acknowledge the Native peoples on whose ancestral homelands we gather, as well as the diverse and vibrant Native communities who make their home in these places today. We also recognize the inherent flaws of portraiture. Since this nation's founding, who is represented and how one is represented reflects the country's flaws as well as its strengths. And the National Portrait Gallery strives to present a more complete narrative, one that acknowledges the history of slavery, racism, and inequality in the United States. Tonight, we're so pleased to present this event as part of the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture. The National Portrait Gallery acknowledges the recent passing of Daniel B. Greenberg, whose generosity and that of his wife, Susan, makes the Greenberg-Steinhauser Forum in American Portraiture possible. Okay, so I want to just give some guidelines again for this Zoom format. Please use the chat function, feel free to comment, but if you want to ask questions, you should use the Q&A feature. And so those questions will be submitted and answered. I will moderate them and I will pose them to our guests. I would like to introduce our guests. Hélène Quanquin is professor of American Studies at the University of Lille in France, and she teaches the history of US feminisms, 19th century reform movements, and the history of marriage in the United States. In her most recent book, titled Men in the American Women's Rights Movement, 1830 to 1890, Cumbersome Allies, which was published by Routledge in 2020, she examines the role of male feminist allies, including Wendell Phillips, and their marriages in the production of feminist ideas in the 19th century. She was a visiting professor at Brown University and the University of Texas at Austin. And Kirsten Pai Buick. Kirsten Pai Buick is a professor of art history at the University of New Mexico. Her teaching and scholarship focus on the material and visual culture of the First British Empire, art of the United States, African-American art, landscape representation, and pro and anti-abolitionist images in the Atlantic world. She received the David D. Driscoll Prize for Child of the Fire, Mary Edmonia Lewis, and The Problem of Art History's Black and Indian Subject, which was published by Duke University Press in 2010. She has been named the Distinguished Scholar of 2022 by the College Art Association. Her second book, titled In Authenticity, Kara Walker in the Eidetics of Racism, is in progress. So let us turn now to the presentation itself. If Hélène and Kirsten could please turn on their cameras, that would be great. And I'm just going to ask our slide guru to advance forward. And I wanted to just talk briefly about the idea that I had to put this conversation together as curator in anticipation of the reopening of our permanent galleries that explore the Civil War of the United States and the subsequent period of Reconstruction. They reopen, I think, this summer. I wanted to ask Kirsten and Hélène to speak with me, especially about these two portraits. On the right, Edmonia Lewis, on the left, Wendell Phillips. Both of them are in the collection of the Portrait Gallery. And so tonight's conversation is going to explore curating, biography, questions of biography, as well as the art. And if you could advance to the next slide, please. This is a layout of our galleries. And so this is sort of the rethinking that the curatorial team I work on did. And on the left, you'll see the Civil War, and on the right, you'll see Reconstruction. And Wendell Phillips, the portrait of Wendell Phillips, which was made by Edmonia Lewis, is that little circle at the bottom left of the screen. And so, yeah, thank you, that's great. Love that arrow moving around there. I wanted to just talk about what it means to curate and think through these kinds of galleries, because the Civil War in sort of yesteryear curating has really hit a lot of the big generals, war, military history, kind of the milestones of war. And instead of doing that, my colleagues and I wanted to think about Civil War and race, and how the Union was, much of the Union's fight really was about ending slavery. And in doing this, I felt very strongly that the Edmonia Lewis portrait of Wendell Phillips should be shown in this gallery. I wanted to highlight how much work the abolitionists had done, even to have a critical supporter in someone like Edwin Stanton, which is, if the arrow could just highlight the portrait that's to the left of the entrance. It's hard to see because these are really small. And Julia Ward Howe, which is in the bottom to the right, exactly. And then you've got McClellan kind of paired with Phillips. And McClellan, of course, is a great strategist who was the general of the Army of the Potomac, who was fired by Lincoln because he didn't actually move the troops and pursue General Lee after Vicksburg. And then there's the Secretary of the Smithsonian to the left, John Henry, the reading of Emancipation Proclamation by Lincoln to his cabinet. And it goes on and on. There's Sherman, who was followed by emancipated and formerly enslaved African Americans when he went through his great destruction of the South. So there's a lot of different stories that you can relate about the Black experience related to the Civil War. Edmonia Lewis made the portrait of Wendell Phillips most likely around 1870, and we think it was from a photograph that she used while she was living in Rome, which has now been lost. And it's interesting because she sat for the same time for her portrait. If you can maybe go to the next slide, please, we can show them. Oh, I'm sorry, this is kind of the, I guess, the zoomed in version of that layout, and then go to the next slide. There we go, that's where I am. Thank you. So she sat for her portrait, which is on the right, around the same time. And interestingly, 1870, I learned, was a turning point for abolitionism activists, as well as activism for Native American rights. We thought that maybe talking about these two things through these figures would be a great way to dive into their portraits and biographies. So now I'd like to turn to Hélène, and let's hear a little bit more about Wendell Phillips and his life.
Thanks a lot, Kate. Thanks a lot for the introduction and for the invitation and for the opportunity to speak about Wendell Phillips and Edmonia Lewis. So by the time Edmonia Lewis made this portrait of Phillips in 1870, he was a very well-known activist. If you can move on to I think the next slide. I just wanted to show you a picture of Wendell Phillips. I think there's a photograph afterwards, maybe.
Sorry, the slides are loading out of order, but I will jump to that now.
No problem. It's okay. So by 1870, he was a well-known activist, and he came from a very privileged background. Thank you. That's the picture. So as you can see, I think in this picture is evident, he came from a very privileged background. He was what we called at the time a Boston Brahmin. His family belonged to Boston's economic and political elite. His father was actually the first mayor of Boston. He was born in 1811, received an education typical of his class, and he converted to abolitionism in 1837. He quickly became one of the movement's most important voices due to his great oratorical skills. He was very often described by his contemporaries as the epitome of the gentleman. And I think, again, that this picture conveys this pretty well. Phillips was also a women's rights man, as they were called at the time. That is, he was a feminist ally. He participated in a lot of women's rights conventions, gave important speeches about women's condition. And after the Civil War, he continued his fight for African Americans' rights. In 1865, so the year when this portrait was made, this picture was taken, he became the president of the American Antislavery Society. But he also fought for workers' rights. In 1870, so when the portrait was made by Lewis, he was the Labor Reform and Prohibition Party's gubernatorial candidate of Massachusetts. So Edmonia Lewis made the portrait of Wendell Phillips when he was around 59 years old, I would say, at a time of transition for him. He had been fighting for the rights of others, as to use his own words, actually, for more than 3 decades. And he was a recognized voice for radical reform. But he had also lost many friends along the way. And sometimes, I would say, around that time, experienced isolation due to political disagreements. So I think that's it for maybe the introduction.
Yeah. I didn't know that his father was the mayor of Boston. The whole Boston Brahmin
exactly
really makes sense now. Yeah, we'd love to hear more about the biography and sort of the challenges of what I think, Kirsten, you've described how for you, Edmonia Lewis was an interesting figure to research. Precisely not much was known about her. I mean, Wendell Phillips is almost the opposite of that, because we can sort of trace his lineage and go way back in time.
Yeah.
And portraiture, we know, doesn't capture a person's entire life. But Hélène, did you want to keep going about, talk to us a little bit more?
I just wanted to react maybe to what you just said, because I think there's a lot about Phillips. At the same time, he's at the same time, I think, an elusive figure as well.
Yeah. Tell us more why.
In terms of legacies, because of we have letters and correspondence by Phillips, but I think he still remains, pretty elusive for different reasons in terms of personal lives, his personal life as well.
Right.
But as you're right, we know a lot about his family and his the genealogy of the Phillipses. So there's
right. Which tells us some things, but maybe not everything.
I would just add that biography can obscure as much as a lack of biography.
Let's move slides forward and talk about Edmonia Lewis. That would be helpful.
Sure. But first I want to thank you for inviting me and providing me with the opportunity to speak with Hélène, whose work I very much admire. And in terms of my initial interest in Lewis, and having to do with the very fact that we didn't know much about her, had to do with training as an art historian in the 80s and early 90s, and seeing how the biographies of people who had gender and people who had race, how those biographies were used to collapse their identities into their work. and the work becomes a kind of reciprocating kind of fantasy of who they may have been. And so Lewis's lack of biography meant that I had to build around her presence, around the locations where she those spaces that she occupied, the time in which she was creative. And I think that lack of biography allowed me to understand, for example, that the work that Hélène does is central to human rights movements, to understanding how you free yourself within marriage, to understand so many things. And so Lewis, what we do know of her is fascinating. She was, her mother was Ojibwe, her father was Black, he might have been Haitian, who came to this country as a free person of color. She was born around 1845 in upstate New York, orphaned young. She was raised by her mother's people and with the help of her older brother, her stepbrother Samuel. And she, born free, educated at Oberlin. That ended tragically. And then she moved to Boston in 1865.
And how did you construct, or what questions did you start with when it's a biography that's really elusive, to borrow Hélène's words?
It allowed me to question those things that we assume we know. Things like a college education. What did that mean for a woman? It wasn't the same thing. Women weren't allowed to study Latin or geometry. They basically studied what we would know as home economics. And so, I'd read over and over again how she'd gone to Oberlin, but no one had really tried to figure out what that meant in terms of what she was educated for and towards, which was educated for her sphere and educated towards the raising of children. And if she was unsuccessful in that, then the teaching of other women's children. In similar ways, I had to understand the Catholic Church because she was Catholic. And so, just to say she was Catholic, we kind of assume that we know what that means. But the Catholic Church is a historic entity. And so they weren't always vocal about abolitionism. Sometimes, especially in the United States, where so many of their European members could be racialized other than white, there was a danger should the Catholic Church espouse anything but pro-slavery. And so here she is, a Catholic in a church that is not defending those things that she believes most strongly in, which is the freedom of Black people. So, what do you do with that information?
How do you reconcile that, really? Hélène, what do you think about women at that time? I know that you were thinking a lot about Wendell Phillips's wife and her influence on him. And obviously, you've written a lot about marriages in the United States.
Yeah.
You're a huge expert on this. So we'd love to hear a little bit more about some of the complexities of abolitionist marriages. Maybe, what Kirsten was just saying about Edmonia Lewis's experiences as a woman. It's, can you compare, I guess is one of my questions. And just tell us a little bit more about Anne Green Phillips.
Yeah. And Edmonia Lewis was single, I think, so she didn't get married. So I think there are different challenges as well. And it's true that the people I study were married, actually. And I try to see marriage and to study marriage, including Phillips's marriage, as a site of production of political ideas. And as a test as well of women's rights ideas in particular. So so Anne Green Phillips and Wendell Phillips are a good example, I think, of these complexities. So when they met in the mid 1830s, and she was already a devoted abolitionist, which he was not actually. And a lot of people said at the time that she converted him to abolitionism. So he gave his first abolitionist speech in 1837. She was described as, often described as a cheerful, vivacious woman. But at the same time, she had health problems, and which actually caused her to, I mean, she couldn't actually travel that much. And it had a huge impact on their marriage, clearly. So I think it's interesting I chose this picture because actually it's the only picture we have of her.
Tell us more about this picture. It's a silhouette.
It's a silhouette, and what I think, so it was actually recovered after her death by Garrison's sons, William Lloyd Garrison's sons, and it was published by them. But what I found, I think, if I remember well, in the letters, is that first of all, I don't think she remembered. She actually wrote at one point in the 1880s that she did not remember. She never had a portrait of herself done. So she obviously did not remember this one. I think it was made in London, actually, in 1840-41, when the Phillipses actually traveled in Europe because of her health, to try to find a cure.
I love it when experts find the correct date of portraits, because that's listed as 1839.
That's what I think. I found this in the correspondence, but I'm not. I mean, that's what the Garrison's sons actually mentioned, but it was much later. But it's interesting that I think she did not remember it as well. But I think in this silhouette, I think shows as well. First of all, because it's profile as well, so it's a kind of mirror reflection to some extent of Phillips's. Lewis's portraits of Phillips. Also, because I think it shows as well that. It illustrates pretty well her position, I think. She was a very determined woman, as I said, with a great personality. At the same time, she was also kept from, she did not interact as much as she wanted. She was also lived in isolation, and Phillips actually was her primary caretaker, which I think is also interesting. What I think is also his contemporaries believed that her condition was also contributed to his isolation, which sometimes people said that her position or her condition actually contributed to his political isolation, because as I said, after the Civil War, there was great division, and he became estranged from a lot of his fellow abolitionists.
Right.
So the complexities, I would say, come of abolitionist marriages and feminist marriages as well. I think in that case are pretty interesting, because you can see, especially in the letters, that they exchanged when sometimes he traveled. You can see the impact she had on his activism. It's clear that they had great affection for one another, but they also discussed politics a lot. Right. Okay, so the marriage actually, I think, was a kind of, or they offered them support.
And
which I think is very important.
Illness. That's one of the questions I just spotted, just since you're talking about.
I'm sorry, what
was Anne's illness? Anne Green Phillips do you know?
I think it's I'm not sure there's an answer to this, a clear answer to this, because from some of the letters you read, especially by some of their contemporaries, I think that some of them believe that it was not that serious at some point. What I know is that she had migraines. She was incapacitated. Sorry. Right. So it's not clear what she had. It's clear what I found in some of the letters is that they that it was clear that her condition was also a way for them to, that it was a constant in their lives, I think. And he actually proposed to her when people believed that she was going to die. She had a crisis, a very, she fell sick very quickly, and he, in a grand gesture, probably, he actually proposed to her, and she recovered, and they got married. But then it's the start of a long illness, which I'm not sure we know exactly.
Yeah, we don't really know much about it, but it's interesting that they have all those letters, and that's, because that does sustain memory. I find it very interesting that the William Lloyd Garrison's sons, kind of saved this portrait. Another set of women's rights men, perhaps. Yeah. But I'd like to introduce this idea.
I think what's also interesting is that she thought it was important enough to remark.
Just one second. I think, Hélène, I'm going to mute you because we're just getting a little feedback, but I will unmute you. There you go. Go ahead.
I was just thinking that it's interesting that that it's important enough to have your portrait taken that she would recall not having a portrait taken. And, it was kind of endemic to the era. You sat for your portrait in whatever medium.
It's a comment on the silhouette as a portrait, the poor man's portrait, which is sort of how it was referred to, sort of known as that layman's kind of portrait work. But Kirsten, I wanted to hear a little bit more from you about the topic of memory and legacy. Why, regarding Edmonia Lewis, was so little information preserved, about her? Was it circumstances? Was there no sons of William Lloyd Garrison to think about her? What happened? And then similarly, after we hear from Kirsten and Hélène, I'd also like you to think about why you think we so poorly remember Phillips today in comparison to William Lloyd Garrison. Because it seems to me that like other historic figures, Wendell was well known in his lifetime, but today he's rather ill remembered. We don't really know much about him. So maybe Kirsten and then Hélène.
I think, what's fascinating for me in terms of Phillips's importance to Lewis is that it's because of his wife, right? It's because of his wife that he develops the position that he does in terms of abolitionism and women's rights and human rights, and in terms of the relative positions of Anne Phillips and Edmonia Lewis. Anne Phillips kind of performs the invalid, the kind of 19th century stereotype of the invalid, whereas Lewis performs the stereotype of the boyish artist, right? And that's how you achieve your spinster persona, unavailable for marriage.
Tell us about her tombstone.
Oh gosh, yeah.
Because it's awesome.
According to the record of her passing, she died of Bright's disease in London in 1907. It's a kidney ailment. She was listed as sculptor and spinster. Yeah.
So it wasn't a tombstone, but it's sort of the record of death.
The record of death, which, you know, is, it records your marital status in this case, or your lack of marital status. And in terms of why she isn't remembered, it has to do with who she was important to at the time that she was active. She was important to abolitionists, and you know, they did this thing where they separated out her so-called Indian heritage and her Black heritage, and abolitionists tended to be interested in her for her Black heritage. She was used as an example of what Black people could achieve if they were given freedom. But once abolitionism was over, their interest in her was over. And she was patronized and patronized. So
Tell us what you mean by that. Patronized.
She was, they helped her, they wrote her into existence in terms of the abolitionist press, but they tended to say cruel things about her in their private letters to one another. And so, in those letters, they were very patronizing about her talent, about her race, about her prospects. Yeah.
Which is insane because she made incredible art. Thank you. Hélène, would you like to weigh in a little bit about memory and legacy?
Memory and legacy, yeah. So as I said, Phillips was very famous. I mean, at the time, I mean, during his lifetime. When he died, actually, Henry Ward Beecher called him the father of the abolitionist movement, which is clearly an exaggeration, given the central role played by, for instance, I mean, Black abolitionists. But he was very famous man, but I think that part of it, and he was also remembered after his death. So for instance, there's an article published by Eugene Debs, the socialist leader, in 1917, in which he remembers inviting actually Phillips to give a talk, and he actually called really Phillips an important figure for him and for his socialism and his socialist activism. So he was actually remembered. But what I think is also, after the Civil War, you have a memory was important. And there were, Manisha Sinha, the historian of abolitionism, has shown that there were abolitionists wrote a lot of reminiscences, biographies, autobiographies, memoirs during that period. And if we compare, for instance, Phillips with William Lloyd Garrison, William Lloyd Garrison's children actually wrote a biography of their father. They made him a central figure of the abolitionist movement, and they made sure that their father was going to be at the center of this history, of this story of the movement. And clearly, I think the role of children, I think, is interesting when we talk about generations, filiations, and how it could be, I mean, not necessarily biological children, but
proteges or even students.
Proteges or spiritual sons or daughters, how they can actually ensure, make sure, or perpetuate or the legacy of people, which I don't think Phillips had really. So he and Anne actually, they had an adopted daughter, but she did not do this job as Garrison's sons did, for instance. So I think it's maybe part of the answer in terms of, I mean, interested in how generations or affiliations. So I think it would be part of the answer, probably.
And we were also talking about friendships, and we were thinking a little bit about in the lifetime at least, if we could advance to the slide of the Anti-Slavery Convention. That I would like to hear from you, Hélène, a bit more, and also Kirsten, about how friendships are central at this moment. And maybe Hélène could just let us know what this thing is that we're looking at first, and then we can kind of get into a little bit more about women's rights and their involvement in politics at this moment.
So this is a painting that was commissioned by the organizing committee of the First World Anti-Slavery Convention in London in June 1840. So it was made by Benjamin Robert Hayden. Some people have described it as a wave of a sea of faces. There are around, I think, 138 faces represented in this picture. And so what you can see, actually, you can see a young Wendell Phillips, or younger Wendell Phillips, on the
red box around his head.
Yeah, the red box. We can't really see him very well. But so I chose this picture as well because I think it represented pretty well for me the importance, as you said, of personal connections in the emergence of women's rights ideas. And I usually use this actually painting when I teach or when I give talks, because I think it's interesting in that it shows, I mean, this convention is usually sometimes known as a kind of beginning of the US women's rights movement, because it's actually a convention from which American female delegates were banned, actually, or were not allowed actually to speak at this convention.
But you do see them in the portrait, in the group portrait. There's a few.
But you can see women, but you can see on the main floor, you can see women, but they are actually British women who were never expected to actually speak. So it's the painter's choice actually to do this, to actually represent these women. But what is interesting is that during that convention, and so Phillips actually gave the speech asking for women's admission in the convention. And when he made the speech, he was asking for female delegates to be admitted, but he was also asking for his wife to be admitted as a speaker because she was one of the delegates. So, and we have evidence that she passed notes to him, actually, and that when he gave the speech, he actually repeated the words that she had written for him. So I think it's an interesting, yeah, exactly. But I think also it was an interesting moment, because it was a moment when friendships were deepened by this event. And I feel that, I mean, in my work on male feminist allies, I try to show how marriage is important, I mean, how important marriage is, but also how friendships are important, and especially male-female friendships could be sites of, as I said, production of ideas, but also maybe more equal relationships out of the reach of marriage legislation at the time, which made women lose their rights when they got married. And friendships. Yeah,
but,
and there was
Kirsten, I was just going to ask about Kirsten, because in our pre-meetings, you know, she talked about the atelier system that Edmonia Lewis was operating in, and I'd like to hear a little bit more about that, but also the friendships, you know, that Hélène is talking about that really obviously helped Wendell Phillips and Green Phillips. What was going on in the world of Edmonia Lewis in that sort of sense?
One of the things that, you know, I would commend scholars like Hélène for is illuminating the ritualization around friendship, the letters, the associations, the networks. For Lewis, we don't really have that. We have a series of betrayals in which, you know, artists like Anne Whitney, and someone asked in the question section about the white Marmorian flock. Her relationship with them was kind of unstable and temporary. You know, Anne Whitney was a friend for a while, but writes home that, you know, Edmonia Lewis became a Catholic so that she could fit in, so that she could be, you know, a majority finally among Catholics. Lydia Maria Child, desecrated her bust of Robert Gould Shaw, and then invited Lewis over so that Lewis could praise her chopping it off
Wow.
at the shoulders.
That's intense.
And so, and Child writes this in a letter not to Lewis, but to Robert Gould Shaw's mother. And so the kind of friendship networks that Hélène illuminates aren't there for Lewis, or they have yet to be discovered. So, after 1870, this kind of pivotal moment when she does Phillips's portrait and sits for her own, she is recalibrating the direction of her work. She's recalibrating her friendships, and she's making friends among European Catholics and American Catholics and Italians. When Frederick Douglass encounters her in 1895, he says that a lot of her English has been lost because she's been speaking Italian for so long.
And in 1870, just reminded us, was that when she moved to Europe?
She moves to Europe in 1865, actually.
Okay.
Yeah.
Just trying to track her bio. So, and she moved around, but she spent quite a bit of time in Rome.
Yeah, and there were a couple of questions about what happened to her at Oberlin. We know the details because of an autobiography, in this instance, by John Mercer Langston. And he was the great uncle of Langston Hughes. And he was a lawyer and one of Ohio's first elected Black officials. And he writes about this case that in which he represented this unnamed client who'd been accused of poisoning two of her white housemates with wine laced with Spanish fly. Oberlin was temperance. Oberlin was, very strict about the separation of genders. And so what happened was these white women got sick on an unchaperoned sleigh ride, and they got caught. And so they blamed Lewis. And in the meantime, you have the Cleveland Plain Dealer, which is a Democratic newspaper, meaning it supported enslavement. It was for the party of enslavement. And they were starting to spread these rumors about two white ladies who had been poisoned. It's rumored that the suspect is Black, I don't like to use the word that was common then, but the subject was Negro, right? And someone in the chat said they don't recognize Black heritage. Her ancestors were from Africa. Well, yeah, of course. And I use the word Black because I didn't want to say Negro, but the Cleveland Plain Dealer is agitating this incident, and Oberlin is protecting Lewis, refusing to bring her forward, and she's kidnapped. And she's kidnapped, taken to an abandoned field and beaten. Hughes says that, or John Mercer Langston says that her collarbone was broken. And so they finally, in this abolitionist town, they finally arrest her in order to protect her. Then she's put on trial, and she's exonerated by John Mercer Langston, and moves to Boston. So that's what happened at Oberlin.
Yeah. Oh my God, it's a really terrible
Right.
story.
That's why I only kind of intimated, because I could spend all day on this. But I chose this image because it speaks to the atelier system in Europe at the time, especially sculptors, neoclassical sculptors. And what they would do is they would go to Rome or Florence, and they'd open a studio, and they'd hire underemployed or out of work Italian artists who were more familiar with working marble than they were, because there was no great tradition like there was in Europe. And so women, however, had a trickier road to travel, because the process was the artist would conceive of the idea, right? The conceptual work was the most prized kind of work in the way this was set up. And then they would translate that idea to clay. It would then be translated into plaster by Italian carvers, and then further translated into marble. Well, Lewis, because the accusations were so easy to make against women that you weren't doing your own intellectual, conceptual work, women tended to work their own marble. And you can see that in Lewis's early work, which the proportions are kind of off, but she was trying, right? Because she didn't want to be charged with not doing her own conceptual work. Well, Harriet Hosmer, who you see here in the center of this photograph.
I love this group portrait. She's such a
right. Well, she has it taken after she's accused of not doing her own work. And Lydia Maria Child writes this defense that's published in the Atlantic, telling you the process and that Hosmer is no different than any other male artist. And so Hosmer has this photograph taken defiant, right, in the presence of her workshop crew. And as I said, I brought this on for a couple reasons. But the other reason is because you see this printed over and over again as part of Hosmer's story, but no one ever has taken or made the effort to name the men and boys in this photograph. Right? So even as we celebrate feminism, what falls away as a result?
Great question. Can we move to the next slide? I want to get to the Q&A, but I do want to honor Kirsten's selection of this image and just hear a little bit more about it, and then we'll get to the Q&A.
So I think it's interesting how we've moved through various strands of portraiture, and you know, kind of they allow us to think about connections to fame and famous faces and famous people. Lewis taking Phillips's portrait in marble bas-relief, which heralds back to ancient Roman sculpture, Abyssinian sculpture, Renaissance profile portraits of famous prominent men and women, but also ceremonial coins, right? And it's in this the most valued material of marble. And then you have Edmonia Lewis in the format of the carte de visite. You know, the size of a visiting card and they were traded, like we trade baseball cards, for example. And they were temporary, but kind of mass produced, right? And famous people, ephemera, as Grace McGowan says. But and people collected them like they collected trading cards. And now the postage stamp. Right? The first commemorative stamp was for the 1893 World's Columbian Exposition in Chicago. The first woman to appear on a stamp was 1902. It was Martha Washington. And then the first African-American is 1940, Booker T. Washington.
Very interesting.
This stamp is actually itself based on a carte de visite. The post office, the artist for the post office modified a carte de visite to create this. And the original is by Augustus Marshall, who lived on and worked on Tremont Street, which was the street where Lewis had her studio and where Edward Brackett, her teacher, had his studio. And the carte de visite was taken in around 1864. So when she arrives, around the time she arrives in Boston.
Wow.
And I think she would have been delighted to be on a stamp.
I agree. And I love that stamp. And she just looks so ready and fierce. Very, very similar to that attitude that Harriet Hosmer was kind of posing with. I want to get to the questions. I think this is a question for Hélène. Is there evidence that Lewis met Phillips? This is from Jeff Welch. Also, did he refer to her or her work disparagingly? I'm familiar with some of correspondence where Lydia Child was quite patronizing. How common was that among white abolitionists?
So maybe Kirsten maybe knows
Okay,
better.
sure.
I think I'm not sure. I'm not sure they met, or do you think or did they meet?
Could they have met in Boston when she was
Probably.
there?
We
Yeah,
don't have
but
evidence, I think, but
yeah.
of this.
Oh, we don't.
Okay,
But,
good. That's a good
yeah, I'm
start.
sorry. We don't have a definitive answer to this question.
That's what this Q&A is for. I love that. Okay, so I want to go back up to the first question from Carol Edwards. During Reconstruction, there was an active community of African-American abolitionists working for full implementation of the 13th, 14th, 15th Amendments. How active was Edmonia Lewis with this community?
Lewis was a figurehead, right? She was someone they pointed to say that we can be artists, we can be creative. And so their patronage of her, right, was also helping them and helping their argument. In terms of her involvement, my former teacher, Elsa Barkley Brown, actually found a notice in a newspaper that after Lewis left Oberlin, right before she goes to Boston, she goes to Virginia and teaches newly freed Africans and African Americans in Virginia. And so, you know, had she the money and the time, I think she would have been a lot more active than she was. But, you know, at some point she just had to leave the United States because it's hard to be free here, even if you have been named free by the government.
Oh, yeah. Okay, thank you. I'm gonna move to the next question. Wasn't it? Oh, sorry, that wasn't the question. Did Phillips ever see the portrait Lewis made of him? What do we think? Probably not.
I don't know. Do you have I have a question for you actually. Can we trace the actually the
Provenance?
how? Yeah.
Not really. I think we can. I'd have to look at the curatorial file, frankly. But I believe that if someone is internet savvy, they can look at the portrait on our website and see when it was acquired and if it was a gift. But I would have to look. Yeah, I don't know. I think I did look, and I don't think I found anything. Now that I'm like digging into my brain about sort of.
I was wondering, but I'm not sure he saw it. But yeah.
I mean, it's an interesting portrait because it's sort of an homage.
Yeah.
What do you think, Kirsten? I mean, what was Edmonia? She was working from a photograph. Was she just antsy and needed something to do? I mean, she got the great hair, that sort of Napoleonic.
She was always, you know, very conscientious about what subjects she chose and who. And so Phillips, she would have admired greatly. We know that just because of newspaper notices that she also did, I think a profile of John Brown.
Okay. Been lost.
Robert Gould Shaw, Wendell Phillips. We think she did a bust of William Lloyd Garrison. She did one of Lydia or Maria Weston Chapman. Right. She was always particular about who she chose. And so
she knew it was a commemoration and it would sort of
right,
last some time.
because they were active for the rights of Black people, of African Americans. And so she honored them.
It speaks louder than words. I love that.
Yeah.
One of the questions was about newspaper coverage of both Lewis and Phillips. What do you think? I mean, they were both in the newspapers all the time, right? Or I'm sure Phillips was in more than Lewis. What would the two of you say?
I don't know if he was more in the newspapers than Lewis, but he was in the newspapers. Yeah, clearly in abolitionist newspapers. He was he gave so many speeches as well, so he was very well known for this. He gave lectures throughout. Actually, he didn't write that much. I mean, he didn't, but his speeches were really the way, or he expressed himself and his ideas as well. So some historians called him a great intellectual, because he was, I mean, but he was a man of speeches, clearly, more than the written words.
Famous for his oratorical.
Yeah, very famous. People always talked about his silvery voice, or he was silver-tongued as well. So that was mostly the main word that was used to describe his oratorical skills. So he was in the papers quite a lot, yeah, clearly.
And Lewis never disappears from the Black press. There's always a mention of her there, or a memorialization of her there. She fades from the US press, except for notices of her arrival to places like San Francisco. Newspapers used to publish who came in on the ships and who came, you know, who was coming in. And so we can track her journeys back to the United States because of newspapers, but not necessarily articles or that kind of thing. Back when I started working on Lewis, you could write to Oberlin and they'd send you a huge clipping file where they collected everything, every newspaper article, every
I love that.
letter. Maybe they provide digital versions now, but at the Smithsonian, there was a retired colonel, Colonel Merle Moore, who is the reason why there's such a large standing file of clippings on Lewis at the National or the Smithsonian American Art Museum.
The art index, American Art Index, is that, or is it the library with the artist files?
No. Colonel Moore just volunteered his time, and he's the one who tracked down her passport. And it's all part of the Smithsonian's standing file on Lewis at the American Art Museum.
Okay, that's
was her work covered in the press in Italy or in Europe in general, or have you found anything?
We haven't found it yet, and sometimes her work is exactly where it should be. There was a noble a Marquis in Scotland, the Marquis of Butte, who converted to Catholicism very publicly, very openly, and commissioned a statue of Christ from Lewis. And it was exactly where it was supposed to be. It's been rediscovered, cleaned up, put back on display. And I'm looking over here for my book. But we just did an entire online kind of celebration of their connection.
I love that.
Because I found I found a mention to Phillips in a French newspaper when he gave a speech on women's rights. So I thought it was interesting as well that they traveled through the press as well.
I have the unfortunate responsibility of ending this conversation, but I want to reassure people that we had so many questions, 23 more questions, and I fell down on my duties as moderator because the conversation was really great and I couldn't get to all the questions. But what we do is we send the questions to our guests and they will have the opportunity to respond to you because we do have emails. So I wanted to thank everyone, especially Kirsten and Hélène. Wonderful knowledge that you've shared with us tonight, and I really enjoy these opportunities to nerd out, if you will, over the Portrait Gallery's collection and learn, from both of you. So thank you.
Thank you.
I want to give a pitch for our next portal, which is March 22nd, and we are featuring our historian of science in conversation with two artists to talk about new approaches to representing women in science. And there should be a link, I believe, in the chat Or you can check us out on Hyperallergic. We have an ad up there. But any last words from our guests?
No, it's
So
an
buy the
honor to
stamps.
be here.
Well,
Yeah,
I
it's
would
a-
like someone to buy stamps for me and send them to me, please.
I'll do
Oh,
that. I'll do that.
Yeah,
So
and
Kirsten and I will
if Kate
both do that.
doesn't, I can do it. I already have four sheets.
Okay.
That's awesome.
I have
Okay.
tons of stamps. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
So in the name of stamps, have a good night. Goodbye, everyone, and thank you again.
Bye-bye.